Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something that hits the wallets of nearly everyone in the U.S. The consistently high cost of prescription drugs. It's a really intricate system, so we've pulled together a range of sources to try and get a solid understanding of what's really going on.
Exactly. We'll be looking at government reports, academic research, news analyses, even projections of how things might change with new policies.
Right.
Our aim really is to cut through all the complexity and give you the crucial insights into why these prices are so high and, what actions are being taken or maybe not taken to address it.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Right off the bat, it's important to understand this isn't exactly a recent development, is it?
Oh, not at all.
For quite some time now, the cost of prescription drugs in the United States has been among the highest. Well, pretty much the highest you'll find anywhere in the world.
That's right. And a key factor, a really key differentiator that sets the U.S. apart is the way the government can, or maybe more accurately, often can, directly negotiate prices.
Yeah, that seems fundamental.
It is. In many other developed countries, the government uses its sheer purchasing power to negotiate lower drug prices, especially for their national health programs.
Not here.
But in the U.S., particularly when it comes to Medicare, that lever for controlling costs has largely been absent. Remember Medicare Part D?
2003, right?
Yeah, that legislation specifically prohibited this kind of direct price negotiation by Medicare. So a core takeaway here is that a fundamental tool for controlling costs, one that's common elsewhere, was, intentionally removed in the U.S. for a major drug purchaser.
But it's not like there's zero negotiation across the board, is it? I mean, the government does engage in price talks for certain programs.
That's a really important point to clarify, yeah. For programs like the Veterans Health Administration, the VHA, the Department of Defense, the 340B drug pricing program that supports certain hospitals and clinics serving vulnerable populations, and Medicaid, too, the government does negotiate drug prices.
And the prices are lower there.
Often significantly lower, yeah. Compared to what you see in the commercial market or even standard Medicare sometimes, it really highlights the difference negotiation can make.
Which really underscores the gap when we look at brand name drugs versus generics. I remember reading that even back in the early 2000s, brand prices were climbing way faster than generic ones.
Indeed. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, they looked at this in a 2005 report, covered the period 2000 to 2004.
What did they find?
They found that brand name drug prices increased 3 times as much as generic drug prices during that time. So you see this clear divergence happening and a growing cost pressure specifically from branded meds.
Then we had the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, in 2010. Part of that was aimed at reducing the financial strain, including prescriptions, right? Especially for seniors in that Medicare Part D coverage gap, the donut hole.
Exactly. The ACA did include measures to tackle that. It brought in rebates and then discounts to help people stuck in that gap.
And eventually closed it.
Eventually, yeah. As you mentioned, that gap was formally closed in 2020, which provided more consistent, predictable coverage for beneficiaries.
But even with those efforts, we've still seen some pretty shocking examples of price spikes, haven't we? I'm thinking back to around 2015, companies like Turing and Valiant.
Oh, yeah. Those situations really brought the issue of what many people just call price gouging right into the spotlight.
Big time.
Acquiring rights to older, off-patent drugs and then, boom, imposing these massive price increases. It led to significant debate, congressional hearings, the whole 9 yards.
And attempts by states to step in.
We saw that too, like Maryland trying to regulate price increases. Yeah, but those faced legal challenges, which just highlights how complicated it is with state versus federal authority in this space.
And who can forget the EpiPens? And insulin. It just felt like those prices were on a runaway train.
Precisely. Between, 2011 and 2016, the EpiPen price during a time with very limited competition went up nearly 400%.
Staggering.
And the cost of insulin, as you said, has also seen substantial hikes over the years. It's created real hardship for so many people managing diabetes. So, yeah, this history really underscores how persistent this high drug price problem is.
Okay, so we have a sense of the history. Now, let's get into the core of why. Why are these prices so high? It feels like a mix of things. One that comes up a lot is the lack of transparency, the sort of variability in pricing.
That's a really critical point. Unlike, the price tag you see on most things you buy, the actual cost of a prescription drug can be incredibly opaque.
Right.
It can vary wildly depending on your insurance plan, which pharmacy you go to, any discounts or rebates that might or might not be applied somewhere in the chain.
So you, the consumer, often have no idea what the real price is.
Exactly. This lack of a clear, straightforward pricing mechanism makes it really difficult for you to know the true cost and make informed choices, if you even have choices.
And then there's this whole concept of market exclusivity. It sounds like these government-granted monopolies are a pretty big deal in preventing price negotiation.
Oh, absolutely. Patent protection and these things called exclusivity periods basically give drug makers a protected window where they're the only ones allowed to sell a specific drug.
No competition.
Exactly. And that lack of competition means they have enormous leeway in setting and raising prices. We've even seen these strategies known as pay to delay.
Where they pay generics not to enter the market.
Essentially, yes. Brand name companies make agreements with generic manufacturers to postpone the launch of cheaper generic versions. It kind of highlights how the patent system can be used not just to protect innovation, supposedly, but also to strategically keep prices high for longer.
Like that AstraZeneca and Nexium case, right? Where the generic was held back for quite a while.
Precisely that example. And research has shown that new drugs launched during these exclusive periods can be way more expensive than similar drugs launched just a few years earlier, maybe before generics were even on the horizon.
And prices keep rising even after launch.
Yeah, the prices of many brand-name drugs keep increasing substantially year after year, often way faster than inflation, while they're still under that protection. So for you, the listener, this means for a long time, you're often paying a hefty premium simply due to this lack of competition.
It's hard not to look at that and think about drug company profits. Public opinion polls seem to consistently show that people think high profits are like the #1 reason for high costs.
That perception does line up with some of the data, yeah. Surveys consistently show the public views drug company profits as a major factor.
And is it true?
Well, some reports have indicated that for many large pharmaceutical companies, their profits actually do exceed what they invest back into research and development. And sometimes corporate overhead is even higher than the profit figures themselves.
Wow. And what about the strategy some companies seem to use? Dominating the market for older drugs, ones without much competition, and then just cranking up the prices.
That's a really concerning trend we've seen. When there isn't meaningful competition, especially for older, maybe off-patent, but still essential drugs, companies can have huge power to raise prices.
Like Allergan. I remember reading about them.
Yeah, we've seen examples like Allergan implementing price increases across a big chunk of their drug portfolio in one go. And if you compare the net income margins, basically, the profitability of large pharma companies to other big companies, say in the S&P 500.
Pharma does better.
Studies have shown the pharmaceutical sector often enjoys significantly higher profit margins, yeah.
And what about the 340B program? That's supposed to help lower costs for certain groups, but I've heard there can be issues there too.
You're right. The 340B program requires manufacturers to give discounts on drugs to eligible hospitals and clinics, those serving lots of low-income patients. Which is good in theory, but a potential issue pops up when these organizations get the discounted drug, but then bill patients or their insurance companies at the full, undiscounted price.
So the savings don't always get passed on.
Exactly. The practice can generate revenue for the hospital or clinic, which they might argue funds other services, but it might not lower costs for the actual patient using that drug. It can seem kind of contrary to the program's original intent sometimes.
Okay, another area that seems to have a surprisingly big impact is orphan drugs. Developed for rare diseases, right? But they often come with these eye-watering price tags.
Yes, the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. It was designed to incentivize companies to develop treatments for rare conditions, diseases affecting small populations. And it's actually been quite successful in spurring that development.
So that's good.
It is good. However, because these drugs treat, by definition, very few patients, and insurance coverage for them tends to be pretty comprehensive.
Like insurers feel they have to cover them.
Pretty much. It means manufacturers can, and often do, price them extremely high. We're talking hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of dollars per patient per year.
Wow. Any examples?
A drug like Soliris, which treats rare blood disorders, is a classic case.
Yeah.
Very high annual cost, but still racks up significant sales because it's essential for those patients. And yeah, insurance coverage for orphan drugs is generally very high, something like 93%.
Okay, and then there's the FDA, specifically the backlog in reviewing applications for generic drugs. It sounds like delays in getting cheaper alternatives out there also keep prices up.
Absolutely. If it takes longer to approve generics here in the U.S. compared to, say, Europe, it means brand name drugs enjoy that monopoly pricing for longer.
How long are we talking?
Well, the median time for generic drug approval has historically been quite significant, sometimes measured in years, like maybe 47 months, according to one older estimate.
Years.
Yeah. Now, there have been efforts to fix this, like the Generic Drug User Fee Amendments, GDUFA, which aim to speed things up by providing more resources to the FDA, funded by industry fees.
Did it work?
It helped. But backlog issues and staffing challenges at the FDA have, at times, still overwhelmed the system and slowed down approvals. Any delay just extends that period of high brand name pricing.
Of course, the counter-argument you always hear from the pharmaceutical industry is that these high prices are, well, necessary. They need them to fund R&D, right? Because developing drugs is risky and expensive.
That's definitely the central argument they make, and there's truth to the cost and risk involved. Developing new drugs is a high-risk game.
Most drugs fail.
A very low percentage of drugs that enter clinical trials actually make it to market, and those clinical trials are incredibly expensive to run. So the argument goes that the U.S. system, with its higher prices, essentially incentivizes companies to take those risks and develop drugs that might not be profitable enough to pursue in countries with stricter price controls.
Okay, so R&D costs are a factor. Finally, let's talk about the middlemen, the intermediaries like pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and this whole system of drug rebates. This seems like a really murky part of the picture.
It certainly is complex and, yeah, often not very transparent. Intermediaries are estimated to handle or absorb a significant chunk of total pharmaceutical spending.
So PBMs, what exactly do they do?
Okay, PBMs basically manage prescription drug benefits for health insurance companies, big employers, Medicare Part D plans, etc. They negotiate with drug manufacturers to get discounts and rebates, and they create formularies.
The lists of covered drugs.
Exactly, the lists of preferred drugs covered by an insurance plan. However, there are real concerns that some PBM practices can actually drive up costs.
How so?
Well, things like sometimes classifying generic drugs as brands for billing purposes, or using a practice called spread pricing.
Spread pricing?
Yeah, where they charge the health plan or employer more for a drug than they reimburse the pharmacy that actually dispenses it, and they pocket the difference, the spread.
Right.
And then you have the whole system of drug rebates. These are payments that manufacturers make to insurance companies or PBMs, often in exchange for getting their drug placed in a favorable spot on that formulary.
Like making it easier for patients to get.
Right, lower copays, fewer hurdles. But the whole rebate system lacks transparency. No one really knows exactly how much money is changing hands for which drugs. And there are big concerns that these rebates might actually incentivize manufacturers to set higher initial list prices just so they can offer bigger rebates.
Which doesn't help the patient much if their copay is based on the list price.
Precisely. It might not lead to overall savings for the system or lower out-of-pocket costs for you, the patient, even though billions in rebates are flowing around.
So it's this messy combination of factors, lack of negotiation, exclusivity, profits, R&D costs, these intermediaries, that creates this environment of super high drug prices.
That's a good summary. Yeah.
And naturally, these high prices have really significant, sometimes devastating consequences for actual people.
Absolutely. The financial burden on individuals can be huge. A significant percentage of people in the U.S. spend like over 10% of their entire income just on healthcare costs, and drugs are a big part of that.
And it's not just financial, right? There are health impacts.
Tragically, yes. Research, like from the West Health Policy Center back in 2020, even indicated a link between people being unable to afford necessary medications and premature deaths among seniors.
That's awful. We also hear about people having to resort to really difficult measures like skipping doses or cutting pills in half or just not filling a prescription they need.
That's right. It's called cost-related non-adherence. And the U.S. has significantly higher rates of it compared to places like Canada.
Because drugs are cheaper there.
Largely, yes. And this failure to take medications as prescribed, often purely due to cost, is influenced by things like age, income, insurance status.
And it can make people sicker.
Definitely. It can lead to serious negative health outcomes, more complications, more hospital visits, which paradoxically can end up costing the healthcare system even more down the line.
Interesting. So having good drug coverage actually saves money overall.
Well, studies have shown that having prescription drug insurance coverage, like Medicare Part D, is associated with fewer hospitalizations and lower overall healthcare spending for those individuals. So, yeah, access to affordable meds seems key.
Which makes it totally understandable why millions of Americans are looking across the border, especially to Canada, trying to get more affordable medicine.
The price differences can be just enormous for some drugs. So it's a very appealing option for many people trying to lower their healthcare bills, even though there are, potential risks and legal complexities involved in importing drugs for personal use.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem pretty clearly, the history, the reasons, the impact. Now let's talk solutions. It seems like there's a whole spectrum of ideas out there, from individual strategies to big policy shifts.
Absolutely. On an individual level, there are definitely things you can try using discount programs like GoodRx or RxSaver.
Those seem pretty popular.
They are. Manufacturer coupons can also lower your copay sometimes. Comparing prices between different pharmacies is crucial. Prices can vary a lot.
And asking your doctor questions.
Yes, asking about 90-day supplies, which can sometimes be cheaper per pill, or asking if there's a suitable, less expensive generic alternative, and even just asking the pharmacist, is this the lowest possible price I can pay? Sometimes there are cash prices lower than your insurance copay.
But there's this ongoing debate about the coupons and discount cards, isn't there? Like, are they really helping overall, or could they actually be pushing costs up in the long run?
That's a really valid point to consider. While these coupons absolutely can reduce your immediate out-of-pocket cost, which is great for the individual right then,
Yeah.
some argue they might mask the true underlying high price of the medication. And by steering people towards more expensive brand-name drugs instead of generics, they could potentially contribute to higher insurance premiums for everyone down the road.
So it's complicated.
It is. That's why exploring those generic options is always really important.
Speaking of generics, they're obviously a huge part of the affordability picture. Cheaper, chemically the same. But even generic pricing isn't always straightforward, right?
No, not always simple. Generics are generally much less expensive. True, because the manufacturers didn't have those massive R&D costs like the original brand company did.
Right.
But generic pricing can still be affected by things like how many companies are making that particular generic. If there's only one or two, the price might not drop as much as you'd expect.
And price fixing.
Unfortunately, yeah, there have been cases and allegations of price fixing among generic drug companies, which obviously limits the cost savings you, the consumer, would otherwise see.
Okay, what about this idea of value-based pricing? Trying to link the price of a drug to how much good it actually does.
The core idea there is trying to assess a drug's worth based on the actual improvement it brings to a patient's health. How much longer do they live? How much better is their quality of life?
How do you measure that?
It often involves complex measures like QLOYs, quality-adjusted life years, trying to quantify both the length and the quality of life gained. Some medical groups, like ASCO in oncology and ESMO in Europe, have developed frameworks to try and grade the value of cancer drugs, for example.
Does it work? Does price match value?
Well, some studies, particularly looking at cancer drugs, have actually found a pretty poor correlation between the price tag and the drug's clinical value based on these frameworks. So it's a nice idea, but implementing it effectively is really challenging.
Seems like policymakers have quite a few tools they could use, though, if they wanted to.
They do. The FDA, for instance, already has mechanisms like giving priority review to generic applications that would compete with really overpriced drugs, where there's little or no competition currently.
Speeding up the competition.
Exactly. There's also been talk about giving the FDA more authority, maybe to adjust those market exclusivity periods for certain drugs, or even allowing temporary importation of drugs from other countries in specific situations where U.S. prices are deemed excessive.
And investigations.
Yeah. Government agencies like HHS and congressional committees have held hearings looking into why some old, off-patent drugs with limited competition suddenly have huge price hikes. Trying to shed light on it, at least.
And we've seen some actual laws passed at the state level, right? Like that California bill focused on transparency.
That's right. California's Senate Bill 17, SB 17. It requires drug companies to give advance notice to state purchasers before they implement big price increases on certain drugs. And it mandates more detailed reporting on pricing and spending trends, trying to force more transparency.
And then there's the big one, government negotiation, like how the military buys drugs.
That comes up constantly. The idea of the federal government negotiating drug prices more broadly, maybe leveraging Medicare's huge purchasing power, similar to how the VA or the Department of Defense already get lower prices.
But that's where the big fight is, isn't it? The whole debate around government price setting potentially stifling innovation.
That's absolutely the central point of contention. Proponents of government price setting point to, look at all these other developed countries in the OECD. They have various forms of price controls, and their drug prices are significantly lower than ours.
Seems logical.
But the counterargument, primarily from the industry, is that those lower prices would reduce profits, which would then reduce the money available for risky R&D, leading to fewer new breakthrough drugs being developed.
Is that true?
It's a complex economic question with arguments on both sides. Some suggest, well, maybe the government could just fund more basic research directly to help offset any impact on innovation.
Other policy ideas floating around?
Oh yeah, lots. Things like insurance formularies are broad and accessible, promoting the use of 90-day prescriptions where it makes sense, maybe encouraging combination pills to reduce copays.
What about monitoring doctors?
There's discussion around prescriber monitoring programs, giving doctors better information about cost effectiveness to help guide their decisions. And again, the idea of modified reimportation laws keeps popping up, though most agree individual importation isn't really a scalable solution for everyone.
And then you get into the really big systemic change ideas like Medicare for all. How does that usually approach drug prices?
Well, most Medicare for all type proposals typically include strong provisions for much broader government negotiation of drug prices. For example, that bill, the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act, or H.R. 3.
Okay.
Its main goal was to repeal that existing ban and allow Medicare to negotiate prices for a wide range of expensive drugs, not just a few.
Based on what other countries pay?
Often using international prices as a reference point, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, looking at other OECD countries with price controls suggests this could lead to big cost reductions.
Yeah.
But you still have that debate about the potential impact on innovation and maybe delays in launching new drugs here compared to elsewhere.
Do those plans have backup options if negotiation fails?
Some proposals included mechanisms like binding arbitration or allowing generic competition sooner if a manufacturer refused to negotiate in good faith or agree to a reasonable price, trying to put some teeth into the negotiation process.
Okay, now let's talk about something that actually did happen. The Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. This was a pretty significant piece of legislation regarding drug prices, wasn't it?
Yes, the IRA represents a really notable shift in federal policy, arguably the biggest move on drug pricing in decades.
What does it actually do?
Its headline feature is allowing the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, to finally negotiate prices for some high-cost drugs covered under Medicare. It starts with a small number of Part D drugs, the ones you get at the pharmacy beginning in 2026.
And Part B drugs.
And then it expands to include some Part B drugs, the ones administered in a doctor's office starting in 2028.
Bro.
The first 10 Part D drugs chosen for negotiation were actually announced back in August 2024.
So negotiation is actually starting, albeit slowly.
Slowly, and for a limited number of drugs initially, but yes, it breaks that long-standing prohibition for Medicare negotiation.
But we also saw some recent actions rolling back earlier efforts, right? Like executive orders on drug prices.
That's true. During President Biden's term, there were some executive orders aimed at things like capping the monthly cost of insulin for some people and trying to expand subsidies to lower out-of-pocket costs generally.
And those were reversed.
Some of those specific price cap measures, particularly around insulin beyond the Medicare cap already in the IRA, were reversed by the Trump administration in 2025. However, it's important to note that the core provisions of the IRA itself, the Medicare negotiation, the cap on out-of-pocket spending for Medicare beneficiaries, other cost controls, those remain law unless Congress acts to change them.
So the IRA framework is still largely in place, even with those specific executive order reversals.
Correct. The IRA's measures represent a significant degree of ongoing federal regulation on drug prices within Medicare.
Which leads us to a really crucial point. What might be the impact of the current presidential administration, Trump's second term? Healthcare policy was definitely a big focus during his first term. What could we maybe anticipate now?
Right. Looking back at his first term, the main healthcare goals really centered on repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, the ACA.
Which didn't happen.
Didn't fully happen, no. Also lowering prescription drug costs, expanding health savings accounts, HSAs, and reforming Medicare and Medicaid. While the ACA wasn't repealed, some key parts were changed, like getting rid of the penalty for the individual mandate.
And on drug costs specifically.
Efforts there had mixed results. Proposals like the most favored nation rule, trying to tie U.S. prices to international ones, faced huge pushback and legal hurdles and didn't get implemented. And despite Trump sometimes saying he supported allowing Medicare Part D to negotiate, no actual legislation moved forward on that front during his first term.
So a lot of talk, but maybe less action on the negotiation front back then. What specific proposals or actions did we see?
Well, there were various legislative proposals discussed, like the Prescription Drug Pricing Reduction Act and talk about allowing drug importation from Canada, but none of those passed Congress. Administratively, they did repeal the Independent Payment Advisory Board, IPAB, which was an ACA entity meant to control Medicare costs, and they pushed for Medicaid work requirement.
Which mostly got blocked.
Mostly blocked by the courts, yes. And there were proposals to change the Medicaid drug rebate program, but again, limited major shifts were enacted.
Okay, so now, what about the Inflation Reduction Act? That's the big elephant in the room regarding drug pricing now.
It is. President Trump has generally been critical of the IRA as a whole, calling it wasteful spending, and has talked about rescinding unspent funds from it.
Could he undo the drug pricing parts?
Well, fully dismantling the IRA, including its healthcare provisions like Medicare negotiation, the out-of-pocket cap, PBM regulations. That would almost certainly require new legislation passed by Congress. It's not something easily done by executive action alone.
And is there appetite in Congress for that?
That's the big question. While Trump himself hasn't recently focused his rhetoric specifically on reversing the IRA's Medicare negotiation or the out-of-pocket caps, his general opposition to the law creates uncertainty. But undoing those popular provisions would likely face significant political hurdles, even with Republican control. So their future is somewhat uncertain, but they are currently the law.
What about the ACA more broadly, and the people appointed to key roles?
There's definitely still uncertainty around the ACA. Trump has made conflicting statements, sometimes calling for repeal, sometimes for replacing it with something else. Congressional Republican interest in full repeal seems lower now than in 2017. However, those enhanced ACA subsidies provided by the IRA are set to expire at the end of 2025 anyway, unless Congress acts to extend them.
And the appointments, Oz at CMS, RFK Jr. at HHS.
Right. The appointments of Mehmet Oz to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, definitely signal potential shifts. Both bring, let's say, distinct perspectives.
Meaning?
Well, you might see a focus on different priorities, perhaps expanding the role of private Medicare Advantage plans, maybe a stronger focus on tackling fraud and waste, potentially reshaping the relationships between government agencies and the pharmaceutical and insurance industries. These appointments suggest the potential for significant shifts in how the administration approaches healthcare policy and regulation overall.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's clear the persistently high cost of prescription drugs here in the U.S. is a really unique and incredibly complex problem.
Definitely.
It stems from this tangled web of factors, the government's limited ability to negotiate, that whole system of market exclusivity, the role of drug company profits versus R&D, and all these intermediaries like PBMs.
It all feeds into it.
And the consequences for people's health and their finances are just enormous, affecting so many Americans. We've talked about solutions ranging from individual cost-saving tricks to major laws like the IRA, which has started to allow some Medicare negotiation.
Right. Steps have been taken, but challenges remain.
Exactly. And the future landscape still feels pretty uncertain, especially given the current presidential administration and the potential for more shifts in healthcare policy down the road.
Mm-hmm. It really highlights that long-standing tension, doesn't it? We've seen decades of resistance to broad government price negotiation, coupled with these strong arguments from the pharmaceutical industry about needing high prices to fuel innovation.
Right. Affordability versus innovation.
Exactly. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
Given this ongoing tug of war, what fundamental change, maybe in perspective, maybe in policy, do you think is the most crucial step we need to take to achieve truly affordable prescription drugs for everyone in the United States, while still making sure we incentivize the vital research and development that brings us new cures and treatments?